In the last autumn in Willow Ridge, Ohio, sunlight fell through rows of yellowing maples and spilled across the porch of the old wooden house where I've lived for nearly half a century. My name is Nora Whitaker, and I am 78 years old today. To outsiders, I'm just an old woman with deep wrinkles and neatly cropped white hair, living alone in a two-story house weathered with time. But beneath this fragile shell beats the heart of a woman who has survived the almost unbelievable 33-year marriage that seemed solid, but in the end was a shattered mirror pieced together from fragments of deceit. I met Malcolm Reed in 1962, when I had just turned 15. At that day's parish fair, I wore a blue dress my mother sewed by hand. He was 5 years older and worked at the town's only pharmacy. The way he smiled, his calm voice, and those steady, proud eyes left me a naive, small-town girl so flustered I didn't know what to do with my hands. We courted the old-fashioned way, meeting after Sunday Mass dates under our parents' watchful eyes and exchanging clumsy handwritten letters I still keep. Malcolm often spoke of his dream to buy the pharmacy, build a career, and become a respected man in town. As for me, I dreamed only of a small house with curtains I would sew myself, and the smell of cakes drifting from the kitchen whenever my husband came home from work. We married in 1964. I had just turned 17. Malcolm was 22. It was a simple wedding in the parish hall. My white dress had been my mother's, altered to fit. I remember his face clearly in the one black suit he owned, the brightness in his eyes convincing me it was a love that would last forever. I trembled so much on our wedding night that I could barely look him in the eye. My mother only had time to say one thing: "Be a good wife, Nora. Do what your husband says." Our first home had only 2 rooms built brick by brick as we could. When our first daughter, Hana, was born in 1965, that tiny room seemed to hold the whole world. 2 years later came Lucas, and in 1970, Grace. I ran the household, raised the children, and did embroidery for a shop on Main Street to help with expenses. Life was hard, but in my memory it brimmed with happiness. Malcolm gradually found success, and by 1972, he had officially bought the pharmacy. He became one of the most respected men in town, always present at community meetings. I was proud of him, of the small family I believed I was lucky to have. But beneath that seemingly perfect surface, a crack had already formed, a crack I didn't dare or didn't want to look at straight on for many years. From the very start of our marriage, Malcolm set a tradition. Every Sunday he went fishing with an old friend named Harvey. He rose before dawn, brewed strong coffee, and took his rod tackle box and the lunch I had packed. "I'll be home before dinner, Dory." He always called me by that tender nickname as he kissed my forehead. I never once met Harvey. I only heard Malcolm explain that he lived in the next town over, and his strict wife disliked having visitors. I believed him because I had been taught that a proper wife does not question her husband. In those years, every Sunday was a loop, taking the children to church, cooking a special lunch, then bringing them to the park. And when the sun set, I waited by the window for Malcolm's silhouette to reappear. Sometimes he brought home a few fish, chattering about how Harvey almost dropped his rod. Sometimes he returned empty-handed, saying the fish weren't biting. The stories repeated. I cherished all of the little gifts he said he'd bought at a riverside market, a handkerchief, a box of candies, as proof of my husband's love for me. Looking back now, I realize each minor detail was a warning sign. But when people are happy, they tend to believe only what they want. So did I, a wife who lived her entire life in absolute trust. 30 years passed. 30 years I kept the family peaceful with quiet sacrifices and unconditional faith. But I had no idea that my life was being rewritten on those very Sundays, according to a completely different script, a script I could never have imagined. This is only the beginning of the journey. If Nora's story speaks to your heart, follow the following parts. Share this piece with someone close. Perhaps the story of an ordinary woman will help someone find the strength to face their own truth. The 1970s flowed by like a river that seemed calm on the surface. As Anna, Lucas, and Grace grew, the house held fewer baby cries, and I began to notice Malcolm's absence on Sundays more sharply. People say a habit kept long enough becomes a rule of life. In our family, Sunday was the day of absence. At dawn, the front door clicked shut. Malcolm's leather shoes faded down the dirt road, and I understood that my only companions would be the 3 little ones for the rest of the day. When they were small, the children would ask Mom, "Why doesn't Dad go to church with us?" I always answered gently, "Dad's fishing with Uncle Harvey. He'll be home later." Their eyes turned briefly sad, but they got used to it. To Anna, her father was a dignified figure seen late at night when he returned. To Lucas, he was responsibility incarnate, a man busy for the family. And Grace, the youngest, would wrap her arms around me and whisper, "I wish Dad stayed home on Sundays to play tag with me." That wish pricked straight into my heart like a tiny needle. Still, I tried to believe everything was fine. In a small town like ours, women often set aside their wants and tell themselves, men need their sky. I did the same. I didn't dare to question. My heart would soften if Malcolm came home safely smiling and hugging the kids. But sometimes strange things slipped in, then vanished like a gust of wind. One afternoon in 1978, a receipt fell from the pocket when I was washing Malcolm's gray shirt. I opened it, and my heart dipped a bill from a restaurant in Milford dated Sunday. I'd heard of that place more upscale than any diner in our town. When Malcolm came home, I asked. He didn't hesitate. It poured that day. Harvey and I couldn't get a fire going. We ducked into the restaurant for lunch and to wait out the rain. The answer was neat and plausible enough to make me feel guilty for doubting. Another time, our nosy neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, came by with an expression half pitying, half smug. "Nora, I saw Malcolm on Sunday in Milford Square. He was with a woman and they were holding hands." I nearly burst into tears, not from anger at Malcolm, but at her. I retorted, "You're mistaken. Malcolm goes fishing. Everyone knows he has kept that habit." Mrs. Peterson smiled oddly and left, leaving a hollow unease behind. I forced myself to bury it, to treat it like passing wind. Sundays went on that way. I drove the children to church and sat in the last pew listening to the homily while stealing glances at the empty seat beside me. Back home, I laid out roast chicken and apple pie, hoping Malcolm might for once arrive on time. Most of the time, he didn't. I seated the children and lay gently, "Dad will be back soon. Let's start. We'll save him a plate." I used smiles to hide my loneliness, but inside I felt smaller and smaller in the house I had built. Sometimes Malcolm returned with a surprise, a silk handkerchief, a box of unusual sweets. He said he'd picked them up at the Riverside Market. I felt both pleased and uneasy. The gifts were lovely, yet foreign, like a scent that didn't belong to me. I stored them in the top drawer of the wooden cabinet out of sight, but not discarded. Over those years, I realized I was learning to live 2 lives. An outward life, the model wife proud of a successful husband and 3 well-behaved children. And an inner life, a fragile woman waiting each Sunday evening for a door to open, proof that her husband still returned. I often asked myself, what if Malcolm doesn't return one day? The question frightened me. I pushed it away, telling myself this life was enough. Only now, looking back, do I see it clearly. My silence nourished nameless lies. And at that time, I had no idea that those husbandless Sundays would become the source of the most significant upheaval of my life, one I could never have imagined. In 1997, Willow Ridge sank into a sweltering summer. Sunlight drenched the narrow streets and scorched the old trees. I was 67, then used to a quiet rhythm, making breakfast, tending the red geraniums on the porch, then preparing Malcolm's lunch just as I had for decades. That day was a Sunday that seemed no different from any other. Malcolm rose early. His footsteps echoed across the old wooden floor. I lay listening to coffee bubbling in the kitchen, its bitter aroma filling the house. Then the door shut, and the car engine turned over. Another day of fishing, I told myself with a familiar sigh. I wore a cotton dress and took Grace, now a young woman, to morning mass. But that afternoon, fate knocked. A little after 2, the door flew open as I was fussing with jars of freshly made jam. Malcolm stepped in, his face drained, sweat beading on his brow. He staggered like a man who'd run too far, his hand clamped to his left chest. "Nora, I don't feel well," he rasped, breath ragged. Panic seized me. I helped him into a chair. I suddenly saw fear in those familiar eyes, something I had never witnessed in the proud man I married. My hands shook so hard I almost dropped the receiver as I called for an ambulance. While we waited, I knelt and held his hand, whispering, "Hold on, Malcolm. It's going to be all right." He tried to speak. His bluish lips trembled. His voice broke, but I heard him clearly. "Forgive me. Harvey is waiting for me." I froze. I thought he was delirious for a moment, remembering his fishing friend. I squeezed his hand, trying to convince myself everything would pass, but deep inside those words pierced me like a blade of ice. The ambulance arrived, its siren ripping through our small street. They lifted Malcolm onto a gurney, fitted the oxygen mask, and inserted an IV. I sat on the van's floor, heart pounding as if it would burst. The hospital in Milford was nearly 20 miles away. The road felt endless. I prayed the entire way, invoking every saint I knew, desperate to keep the man who had been my pillar for over 30 years. Through the ER window, I watched doctors and nurses rushing. Time dripped by painfully slowly. After a while, a doctor came out, eyes heavy. "We'll do everything we can, but the myocardial infarction is severe." I collapsed into a chair, face in my hands. A flood of memories surged: the simple wedding, our first 2-room house, infants' cries, suppers that were humble but full of laughter, all of it stacked on my chest. When they finally let me into the ICU, Malcolm lay there pale and still, breath hitching beneath the oxygen mask. I sat beside him and held his hand, once strong, now cold and trembling. He opened his eyes and looked at me one last time. "Nora," he breathed. I leaned close. "I'm here. Forgive me. Harvey is waiting." Then his eyes closed, and they did not open again. That night, Malcolm Reed died. His heart stopped after 33 years with me, and 33 years in which I believed I knew him. The funeral unfolded the way small towns do. The pharmacy closed for 3 days. Neighbors, friends, and co-workers came with flowers and casseroles that filled the kitchen. I wore black, my face like carved stone, accepting each consoling embrace. My children knelt beside me, sobbing. One thing struck me: his dear friend Harvey, who had accompanied my husband on countless fishing trips, was conspicuously absent. When I mentioned it to Hana, she only shook her head. "Maybe he's old now, or out of town, Mom." I nodded and asked no more. But deep down, a vague suspicion clung like a shadow. Malcolm's final words, the name he spoke as he was dying, and that strange absence together cracked open a small door to a secret room I had never entered. I didn't yet know that behind that door lay an entire parallel life, a secret nurtured by those seemingly harmless Sunday fishing trips. And soon enough, that door would burst wide open. 3 months after the funeral, the house on Maple Street felt suffocatingly silent. The laughter that once filled it was now only a memory. Anna had returned to the capital with her young family. Lucas buried himself in engineering work in New York, and Grace lived nearby but was busy with her own. I stayed behind alone, facing a house too big and too empty. People say that when someone dies, their memories remain scattered in every corner. It's true. The hall still smelled sharply of cigarettes, what Malcolm sneaked at night. The main bedroom still held his shaving lotion. The nightstand drawer was packed with old receipts and notes. I didn't dare to touch any of it. One touch and the pain would surge. But one sweltering day in July, when I looked up at the high garage shelf where Malcolm kept his odds and ends, I knew the time had come. If I didn't face this, the house would remain a mausoleum. I forced myself to tidy up bit by bit as a way to step forward. Light poured through the small window, catching dust motes in the air. I pulled down old boxes, car tools, scuffed work boots, a crate of mildewed books. Then, in the darkest corner behind the paint cans, I found an old shoebox tied with frayed string memories scrawled across the lid. My heart thudded. In all our years together, Malcolm had never labeled boxes. My hands trembled as I untied the string. The musty scent of old paper rose. First was a stack of old photos, yellowed frayed at the edges. Malcolm stood beside a thin, dark-haired fellow with a tight smile as a young man. They held fishing rods. The Ohio River was behind them. I flipped one over. Malcolm and Harvey, June 1965. I froze. Harvey, the fishing friend, was honest, at least in youth. But why did the photos stop in the 60s? Why is it not recent? Next, I drew out a carefully folded newspaper. An obituary from Milford dated July 22, 1965. Harvey Cole, 25, killed in a car accident. His wife, 6 months pregnant, survives him. Ice spread through me. Harvey had been dead for more than 30 years. Yet Malcolm, my husband, had claimed to go fishing with him every Sunday for decades. What kind of lie could last that long? Hands shaking, I kept searching. A small handwritten address book appeared. Many entries, one stood out: 47 Oak Street, Milford, Apptent 2. Beneath it lay a stack of rent receipts from 1966 to 1997, every one in the name Malcolm Reed. I could hardly believe my eyes. For over 3 decades he had secretly maintained another apartment. For what? The answer lay in the greeting cards neatly at the bottom. Soft, fluid handwriting signed, "With love, Elena and the children." Birthdays. Christmas, Father's Day. Each card was a blade across my heart. I pulled out the final photo. Malcolm, hair gone gray, wrapped an arm around a woman I didn't know. Beside them stood 2 young adults, a son and a daughter. On the back, silver anniversary, August. Elena, Julia, and Ben, 1992. August. The name stunned me. To me, he was forever Malcolm Reed, husband, father of my children. But to the family in that photo, he was August, a different husband and father. I sank onto the cold cement floor of the garage, photos, clippings, and cards strewn around me, all those years of trust, sacrifice, and waiting only half a life. The man I called my husband had lived another life with another woman just a few miles away. I cried, tears mixing with dust and dripping onto the old shoes Malcolm wore to go fishing. The scattered pieces began to lock into place, the strange scents, the restaurant bill, Mrs. Peterson's rumor. I had been blind, trusting too completely. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the open shoebox, the secret laid bare, a bleeding wound. And inside me, a smoldering flame flared up. I had to know everything. After a sleepless night with the shoebox, I knew I couldn't sit still. Those secrets weren't just lies. They were an entire life running parallel to mine right nearby, and I had never known. The address in the little book blinked like a warning light urging me on. The next morning I chose my old navy dress, the one I wore to my first grandchild's baptism. I tied my hair back and dabbed on pale pink lipstick. In the mirror I saw the face of a widow with dark circles under her eyes, but the gaze had changed. It was firmer, sharper. I carried the shoebox against my chest like a shield. The bus ride to Milford took 30 minutes. Compared to Willow Ridge, it was busier, more shops, more cars, a quicker pace. I got off near Oak Street, shaded by maples and lined with pastel-painted houses. Number 47 came into view, a light blue 2-story with white doors and a small porch draped in scarlet bougainvillea. It felt warm and homelike in a way that jarred against the chill in my heart. Before I could knock, a woman appeared in the yard. Simple floral dress, silver hair in a neat bun, a watering can in her hand. Her eyes were bright and kind when she looked up, and I froze. Elena. I recognized her, the face from the photo with Malcolm. "Excuse me, can I help you?" she asked softly. My hands shook as I drew the photo from the shoebox and held it up. "Do you know this man?" Elena's eyes lit. A small smile touched her lips. "Of course. That's my husband, August. Are you a friend of his?" That name again, August. My chest tore open. I drew a breath and kept my voice steady. "I'm Nora, and August is also my husband." The watering can crashed into the cement, spreading in a long stain. Elena's face blanched. Her hands trembled. I thought she might collapse, but she gripped her skirt, lifted her chin, and met my gaze. I saw no hostility in her eyes, only shock laced with fear. She invited me inside. The living room was small and tidy, its walls hung with family photos, Malcolm or August in intimate moments, an arm around Julia, laughing with Ben holding Elena's hand at an anniversary. I sat on the sofa and set the shoebox on the table. "Your husband, he passed away 3 months ago, didn't he?" Elena began, voice unsteady. "Yes, and I believe you buried him 3 months ago as well." Silence sliced the room. Two widows looked at each other and recognized the bitter truth: we shared the same man and grieved the same loss, but of two entirely different lives. I opened the box and spread the photos, cards, and receipts. Elena clapped a hand over her mouth and sobbed when she saw the familiar script: "With love, Elena and the children." I told her about the Sunday fishing with Harvey, who in fact had died in 1965, about the 3 decades I'd believed in that fabricated tradition. Then Elena pulled an album from a drawer. She showed me their 1967 wedding, Julia's high school graduation, and Ben in his first white coat. To Elena, August was a devoted husband and kind father. He traveled the state Monday through Saturday, and Sundays were for family. They never suspected a thing. For hours we spoke more with tears than words. Details overlapped, fragments meshed, exposing a terrible picture. Malcolm August had lived 2 complete lives for over 30 years. As evening fell, I looked at the woman before me, the one I should have called a homewrecker, and saw only a soul twinned with mine in pain. Elena had been deceived, just as I had loved with her whole heart, sacrificed her youth for a man who split his own in 2. When I left Oak Street, it felt like stepping out of a nightmare. But in truth, the nightmare had only begun. From that moment, I understood my life was no longer singular. It had been halved like the man I called my husband. I returned to Oak Street on a cloudy afternoon, still reeling from our first meeting. Elena had called me, voice trembling but firm. "You should come. I found something. I think we both need to see." I saw a thick brown leather notebook with worn corners on the upholstered chair in her bright living room. On the cover, in Malcolm's August's familiar hand, River Memories 1965-1997. My fingers on the cover felt like touching the heart of the man who had betrayed us both. Elena opened it. The first pages were even lines describing fishing trips with Harvey, the sound of waterfish on the line, scraps of talk from youth. I could picture the 2 young men on the Ohio's bank sharing dreams, fears, and confidences reserved for best friends. Then in July 1965, the script grew jagged. "We buried Harvey today. A part of me lies in that ground. How do I go on when the only person who truly understands me is gone?" My hand shook. Elena laid a careful, warm palm on my wrist. "After that, something strange began," Malcolm wrote, as if Harvey were still alive. "We landed 3 big fish today. Harvey told me about his new job and laughed until he cried." I looked at Elena, my voice caught. He imagined Harvey still fishing with him. Elena nodded, her eyes a deep, aching sorrow. Then another name appeared. Elena. A 1967 entry read, "I haven't told Harvey about Elena. I don't know what he'd think, but with her I feel a freedom my other life never gave me. I knew that other life was me, the lawful wife who had married him 3 years earlier." The next page confessed, "With Nora, I am Malcolm the husband, the exemplary father. With Elena, I become August, the man I dreamed of being before duty bound me too young. I can't choose. I need both to exist." My eyes blurred, but I kept reading. Months stretched into a chain of admissions. On one side, my family, our children, our small house, a Sunday table with an empty chair. On the other hand, Elena and 2 other children, Julia and Ben, and the image of him returning to Milford with an unburdened smile. What chilled me was his self-justification. To give up one would be to lose half my heart. Both lives, both women are me. Gregory Harvey says I can't keep this up forever. But I choose silence. I will live both lives until I can't. Elena read alongside me, tears sliding down. "See," she whispered. "He didn't just lie to us. He lied to himself." The entries of the 1980s took on another tone: fatigue confusion. Today, I almost called Elena Nora. Harvey joked that my memory's failing. But how do I tell the difference anymore? Every night I dream of 2 houses, 2 dinners, 2 voices calling me husband. Near the end, only months before he died, the writing trembled and broke. I dreamed you met each other. No secrets, no division. Harvey says that's heaven where lies don't exist. But when I wake, my chest aches. Maybe it's time to end this. We closed the diary. Under the lamp's glow, 2 widows sat across from each other, not strangers, not exactly adversaries. A vast truth had torn apart everything we once believed. Alongside the pain, a quiet kinship rose. No one else could understand the feeling of being split in 2 as we did. That night, leaving Milford with the diary in my arms, I knew his confession could never erase the betrayal. But it revealed something else. I had lived with a man who was never whole, a soul perpetually divided. And the question before me was no longer, why did he deceive us, but what will I do with the life that remains, now that the truth is bare? After finishing the diary, Elena and I fell into a heavy silence. The truth didn't stop there. The more we examined the papers in the shoebox, the clearer it became. Beyond love, Malcolm August had left a tangled financial maze connecting both families. I remembered recent years when Malcolm suggested selling a plot I'd inherited from my parents outside town. He said bank interest was useless, and investing in the pharmacy would be better. I believed him and signed without question. As Elena laid out med school tuition receipts for her son Ben, I realized with a jolt that money from my parents' land had helped fund the doctor dream of the other family's child. Likewise, Elena said August often complained the drug trade was shaky, so she pinched pennies from her cooking class income to raise the kids. But he used profits from the Willow Ridge Pharmacy, what should have been my old age safety net, to pay Milford rent and her household costs. In other words, we both had been robbed of what was ours to feed an illusion called 2 lives. Elena lowered her gaze, voice tight. He took from you to give to me, then from me to give to you. We both lived on the leftovers of his calculations. Bitterness rose in my throat. Yet I couldn't deny another truth. Without these funds, none of our children on either side might have had the chances they did. The most painful question crashed in. Should we tell our children? I pictured Anna, my sensitive eldest, who saw her father as a rock. Lucas, the New York engineer, always said his work ethic came from Dad. My youngest and closest to me, Grace, never stopped praising him as a family man. I'd topple the monument in their hearts if I revealed the truth. Elena wrestled with the same dilemma. Julia and Ben adored August as the perfect father. They had no idea that for 30 years their dad had another home, another wife, other children. We sat in long silence. The pendulum clock cut the air with each stroke. At last I said, sooner or later they'll find out. If not from us, then from someone else. Isn't it better if the truth comes from their mothers? Elena nodded, eyes wet, but saying it is like destroying their best memories with our hands. In the following days, I carried the question home and wrestled with it each night. I opened every drawer and box Malcolm left, searching for answers. I found more damning proof: bank statements, deeds of transfer. The picture was complete. He hadn't blundered into this. He planned to cycle money between 2 families. This truth was no longer ours alone. It had crossed beyond love into our children's assets, rights, and futures. One evening, I called Anna. Her voice was warm, still calling me my dear mother. My throat tightened. How could I tell her the model father she worshipped was only one shard of a parallel life? I knew I couldn't keep it forever. Soon, Elena and I would face the hardest moment, sit in front of our children, and tell them their father had never truly belonged to any one family. That night in the dark, my hand rested on the thick diary. I saw clearly this pain wasn't only mine or Elena's. It would pass on to the next generation, and how we choose it would shape our children's futures. Thus, Malcolm August's betrayal didn't end with 2 women. It had become a burden for 2 families, 2 bloodlines, 2 currents of life, and we had no choice but to speak the truth. In the days after we confessed everything to our children, Elena and I were like 2 castaways washed onto the same shore. with no choice but to lean on each other to stand. Each child reacted differently. Anna sobbed and went silent for a week. Lucas coolly asked, "So who was Dad?" Grace couldn't hide her fury and called him a coward. On the other side, Julia and Ben also lost their footing. Julia felt deceived to her core. Ben, on the cusp of medicine, suddenly questioned every value he'd been taught. We mothers became the only bridge preventing collapse. But how could we lift them when we were still trapped under rubble? One afternoon in Milford, we sat in Elena's kitchen, coffee gone cold. She said quietly, Malcolm, always stopped me from opening a small place. I wanted a restaurant to cook what I loved, but he called it fanciful. Now I think he feared the truth would slip if I stood on my feet. I said nothing. Images flashed of the times I proposed expanding the little market I managed in Willow Ridge. Malcolm would scoff, "You should stay home. Ambitious women only invite trouble." For years, I mistook it for care. Now I saw it was a restraint. We looked at each other for a long time. A shared idea flickered faint at first. Why not do what we had been denied all our lives together? The plan to open a restaurant together was conceived then. At first it felt wild. How could two widows of the same man become partners? But the more we thought, the more it seemed the only way to turn humiliation into strength. Elena nodded, resolve glinting in her eyes. If years were buried under lies about Sundays, let's make Sunday our new beginning. We found a long vacant building exactly between Willow Ridge and Milford. Once a warehouse, its roof leaked and paint peeled. The broker shrugged. Only you two would want it. But its worn bones made us believe it could be reborn like us. Our children initially objected. Anna said, "Mom, you don't need to throw yourself into another battle." Julia was blunt. "I don't see why you'd team up with her." Yet when they heard our determination, they softened. Lucas offered to help with design. Grace promised to do the books. Ben tapped med school friends for weekend shifts. Slowly they saw no rebellion, but the only way to save what remained. We named the restaurant the Sunday Fisher. The first time we said it, both of us shivered. It had been the emblem of deception of empty Sundays. Now bolting it to the signboard, we turned it into a declaration the days stolen from us would become the foundation of our new life. The renovation was grueling. Some days, Elena and I stood in dust-smeared clothes amid piles of broken brick and laughed at the absurdity. The gap between the first wife and the second wife vanished in those moments. We were simply two betrayed women holding hands and moving forward. The day we hoisted the sign, I lifted my face to the late winter sky and felt a lightness I'd never known. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for a man to come home. I was waiting for something else, a new life that Elena and I would build with our own hands. Opening day at the Sunday Fisher dawned pale blue March wind still edged with winter. After months of preparation, my heart still thumped like a girl's first time on stage as customers began to arrive. Elena worked in the kitchen, cheeks flushed from heat and nerves. I greeted guests out front with Anna and Grace. People from Willow Ridge and Milford came in droves, part curiosity, part the spread of our unusual story, two widows opening a restaurant together. Laughter rose. The scent of grilled fish and herbs warmed the room. I thought perhaps for the first time in decades, Sunday wasn't a wound, but a beginning. Then an older man appeared in the doorway, leaning on a cane, eyes bright beneath a crown of white hair. His suit hung loose on his thin frame. When our eyes met, something eerily familiar pricked my skin. "Excuse me, are you Mrs. Nora Parker?" he asked in a steady baritone tinged with tremor. I froze, hands rigid on the tablecloth. Elena stepped out from the kitchen and stopped short at seeing him. He introduced himself. "I'm Samuel Wilson, Harvey's father." The room seemed to harden. That name Harvey had been the private password of decades, the cover Malcolm used for his imaginary trips. And now his father stood inside a restaurant bearing the emblem of that lie. We seated him by the window. His hands shook as he removed his fedora and placed it carefully before him. After a moment, he said, "I read the reports when Malcolm, or August, or whatever name he used, died." Then I saw news of this restaurant. When I learned you two owned it, I knew the past had finally come to light. Under the table, Elena gripped my hand. I felt her pulse quicken. Samuel told his story slowly, piece by piece. Harvey and Malcolm were inseparable. After the accident in 1965, I saw Malcolm cry like a child beside my boy's coffin. Then he vanished for weeks. When he returned, his eyes had changed, as if half his soul had gone to the grave with my son. I don't know how he carried that pain, only that from then on he lived with Harvey's ghost. He paused, taking a long breath. Years later, I ran into him in Milford. He introduced himself as August, with a woman and a little girl. I didn't speak up, but the pleading in his eyes told me enough. Malcolm had chosen a two-faced road. Elena and I were mute. What we endured didn't root in some ordinary temptation, but in a soul wound, the loss of a friendship etched in bone. Samuel looked at us, voice heavy. "I'm not here to judge. I only want to know, have you found any peace?" My throat tightened. Peace. How do you call it peace after a life of deception? And yet how could I deny that Elena and I had built something new from this ash heap, not for Malcolm, but for ourselves and our children? Elena answered for me, low and resolute. "We're trying. This restaurant is proof we're more than victims. We chose to go on." Samuel's smile was faint, eyes moist. If Harvey were alive, he'd want to see this. He once dreamed of a little riverside inn feeding travelers. Strange, in a twisted way, Malcolm left you to fulfill my son's dream. When he left, shrinking into the late afternoon sun, I felt a circle close. Harvey, Malcolm. August. The tangle of names had led us to one last truth. The past may be a lie, but the present is our choice. On opening day, amid joy and tears, Elena and I understood we were no longer haunted by sham fishing trips. From now on, each Sunday would prove our power to begin again. Time passed, and the Sunday fisher ceased to be a curiosity and became a familiar fixture in Willow Ridge and Milford. More guests came not just to eat, but because they sensed something true in every dish and every smile, pain transformed into strength. In the mornings, I rise early, open the upstairs window, and look down the quiet road. Sunlight catches the carved wooden sign. The Sunday fisher and I remember all those Sundays past. There were days I sat by a window, waiting for a man to return with the promise of fishing with a friend. Now, at that same window, I wait for customers, for the scent of grilled fish from the kitchen, and for grandchildren's laughter. Elena is different. She found joy in the kitchen, where flavor is a language of healing. What she cooks isn't merely for sale, but a message from a long journey. I've seen her stand a while over a gently bubbling soup, gaze far away, and murmur, "August once said this dish wasted time. Now I cook it for myself." At that moment, I understood that true freedom doesn't begin with leaving a man. It starts with living your own dream. Children from both families stopped by more often. Duty at first, then, because they realized this place helped them mend. I've caught Anna and Julia, once strangers, sitting together in a corner planning decor. Lucas and Ben, though in different fields, swap stories of work and how their father's shadow lingers over their choices. Grace, my fiery youngest, learned restraint after breaking down in the kitchen one day when she saw Elena gently coaching a staff member, something her father never did for her mother. We two women who once seemed destined to be enemies now watch our children grow and recognize that we share the same pain and power to rebuild from ashes. Sometimes when the dining room calms, Elena pours tea and says softly, "He split our lives in two, but he also left us the chance to piece them into one new life." I don't argue. It sounds like a paradox, but deep down it's true. In our first year, I sold the old house in Willow Ridge, the fortress of counterfeit memories. I thought it would hurt, but when those familiar doors closed, I felt only lightness. Elena left her Milford apartment to move into the rooms above the restaurant. Now we live in two neighboring spaces, private yet close, like parallel lines that finally found a crossing. One summer night after closing, we sat on the back porch under a sky full of stars. Crickets sang from the river grass. I held Malcolm's diary, the one that started it all. This time I opened it without trembling and read the last lines, my voice rough but steady. I dreamed of heaven, where there are no secrets and everyone knows the truth. Elena was quiet, then set beside me another book, Harvey's fishing log, which his father had given us. 2 notebooks, 2 hands, 2 lives bound together. We no longer needed more answers. The truth was enough. I closed both and placed them in a small wooden box. "Leave them here for the grandchildren," I said softly. "They must know their father's fathers and grandfathers' names, so they won't repeat them." Elena nodded, her eyes firefly bright in the dark. At that moment, I felt the past truly settled, not fully forgiven, but accepted, not forgotten, but no longer in control. The next day, with the room bright and bustling, I stood amid the clink of dishes and layers of laughter, the smell of Elena's grilled fish drifting out. I understood self-liberation isn't a day or an hour, but a whole journey. And I have begun it with Elena, with our children, in a restaurant whose once haunting name symbolizes rebirth.